Hello there, I'm the Serial Plagiarist, and today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, that being the fourth Indiana Jones movie known as Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Just like the prequels, I enjoyed this movie immensely and had absolutely zero idea about the online hatred until I started really using the internet. Looking at surface level reviews, it seems like the haters are just people who want to spite George Lucas, just like the prequels. It's telling given how all the hate is directed at George, and rarely is his friend Spielberg, who directed the movie despite him having to have approved of the ideas George had. When people talk about Spielberg in this movie, they just call it a stinker in his career or something. If the so-called critics were completely fair and unbiased, they would have trashed Spielberg for this movie just as much as George Lucas. But Lucas only got the hate to reinforce the prequel hate narrative. It's lazy criticism. What I want to achieve with this video is to prove the quality of this film and the overblown hatred for the film is undeserved, and at best, people should only call it a disappointment if they were unsatisfied after 20 years. That's it. Scratch that. That film isn't a disappointment in any sense. Because this film didn't ruin Indiana Jones or his saga. That's what we'll get into first. So people like to say that Last Crusade's ending was achieved because of this movie, which is something I highly disagree with. Looking at the Indiana Jones franchise, there are so many other stories with Indiana Jones, and it's not exclusive to the films. There's a TV show that exists called The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles that continues the stories of Indiana Jones. So it wasn't like the trilogy ending meant the end of Indy's adventures as a whole. Obviously they were going to do a lot more with the character in the future. So I want to go through Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and discuss why it's an actual good movie and a solid entry in the Indiana Jones film saga. So the film starts off without any Indiana Jones. Instead, it's the opening credits that shows us the names of all the actors in this movie. What I think the opening does well is establish the setting. We've moved away from the 1930s and now we're in the 50s, a nostalgic time period for George Lucas and likely Spielberg too. I think this opening establishes the setting and the time period very well. All the set pieces and costumes are immersive. Usually a film never convinces me that it's actually set in the time frame it's set in, especially as we get further and further away in time. As an example, The Thing 2011 never fully convinced me it was in the early 80s because of the haircuts and other small things that were off. While in this movie, I am fully sold on the setting. It's very much like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were returning to the time period. Hound Dog by Elvis Presley may be a stereotypical example, but it's probably the best song they could have used for the opening. That being, to get you excited to watch the movie. So I like the choice in song as it gives an exciting and upbeat start. The story isn't set up until after the intro, but that's okay. Raiders of the Lost Ark's prologue had a completely irrelevant opening when you think about it, aside from setting up one of the villains, but it served the movie. So when the story officially starts, the first thing we're introduced to are the villains. American guards close off Area 51, and the Russians ambush them and kill them all. The big, tough Russian guy is pretty intimidating. He's tall, bulky, and imposing, and given how he's played by an actual Russian, that says a lot. A lot of people assume that all the Russians in the movie are just actors pulling accents, but that's not the case at all. The Soviets, after pushing into the base, throw out Mac and Indy. Indy's reveal I especially like. First, they throw out his iconic hat, and then they throw the man himself out of the car where his face is out of shot, building up to when we truly see the character again. Now, a criticism I've seen online is that people don't like an older Indiana Jones, and cites the reason why James Bond gets an actor swap every so movies is because they want to keep the character the same age. And it doesn't work with Indy because he was originally designed to be the American competitor to James Bond. I don't know why people care about the older Indiana Jones so much. Harrison Ford has the exact same charisma he did all those years ago. And I want to ask something. If they were going to do a movie in the 30s again, then what would they have done? Nazis as the villain doing an occult thing has already been done twice, and Temple of Doom has its adventure be done in Asia. but there isn't much other historical enemies for Indy they could have done, to be honest. Plus, I like that now we've moved on to 1950 serials, where the Soviets are the bad guys. It might seem stereotypical, but it's quite clearly based off actual 1950 serials. As I've said before, this movie is very 50s in feel. This film is practically a modern 1950s serial. Now, aside from that, we get introduced to new characters, as we do with every new Indiana Jones adventure. Indy's got a partner named George McHale, otherwise known as Mac, and in a classic George Lucas trope, the relationship between the two characters is set up by recounting things they did in the past.
This ain't gonna be easy.
Not as easy as it used to be.
Well, we've been through worse.
Yeah? When?
Flensburg, there was twice as many.
I haven't felt you this tense since we fell into that nest of gundarks.
Immediately, the relationship is set up. These are two professional partners and friends, and just like Anakin and Obi-Wan, they don't always get along. I've said in my Battle of the Heroes video that two friends in a story don't have to be lovey-dovey with each other to be convincing friends. Friends argue. It's part of interactions. If they were solely friendly the whole time, that wouldn't make a convincing friendship. So I'm glad George Lucas took some cues from his previous work and didn't listen to those stupid critics. The big Russian guy I mentioned earlier, Dovchenko, shows up and punches Indy in the face before we are introduced to the main villain, Irina Sparko, played by a non-Russian, Cate Blanchett. You know, while researching the cast, I came to realize that a lot of the Russian characters with speaking roles were from Russia or other ex-Soviet countries. It's really only Blanchett, the main villain, who isn't Russian. She's from Australia. Personally, I would want to hire someone who's regionally close to or in Russia, but then I was told it's more about who's right for the role, rather than who's best for regional consistency. I think the criticism that the Russian accents in the film are fake come from people who don't realize that most of the actors are from Russia or from similar regions. I've heard criticism on the film's villains looking past the Russian stereotypes, and I wanted to discuss my take on the matter. Personally, I think the villains in this film are on par with the ones in the Indiana Jones trilogy. If you want to argue stereotypes, the original trilogy had those in some respect. I mean, the main villain is an arrogant, knowledge-hungry agent with the distinction from other villains being her fencing and sword abilities. We've got distinct traits. I've heard the complaint that her character is underdeveloped, which I wholeheartedly disagree with, because her motivation is quite clearly laid out in the film. She wants to use the knowledge of the aliens of the Crystal Skull to win the Cold War. Her motivation was on par with all the other Indiana Jones villains. For example, Walter Donovan wanted immortality from the Holy Grail and aided the Nazis in order to do so. That's literally all his motivation adds up to on the surface level. Walter wanted immortality, Sparko wants knowledge. Like, I see as much depth in Sparko than I do the other Indiana Jones villains. Mostly the other villains in the film are just henchmen. Like Dovchenko, he's just there to be the intimidating tough guy, but it works with how he was designed. With Irina Sparko, I like that she's consistent with how Indiana Jones interacts with women, as there's similarities to all his other encounters with female characters. So there's attention to detail there. So moving on, the Soviets open the warehouse, where we get some insight into what the Russians want, that being mummified remains. So Indy comes up with the idea of using the gunpowder to track where the remains are in the warehouse. I like this part because there's proper build up to the discovery. Like the exchange between Indy and Sparko talking about the remains and a vague mention of what it was creates intrigue. And I like the small part where Indy gets shotgun shells from a Russian emptying his gun, which I found to be really cool, especially in the audio department. So another thing to praise is the audio. It's pretty damn good. Like, obviously not everyone is going to notice this sound and be like, hey, that was a great sound effect. It's the sound effect that assists this particular shot. So Indy helps the Soviets find what they're looking for, and hat off to John Williams for composing the score as the music picks up. So it's revealed visually that the main mythology of this movie is aliens. This is yet another big criticism of the film. Now personally, the reason I believe Aliens works quite well in this movie is not just because it's something new, but it goes back into my point about this being a modern 1950s serial. Now I watched the behind the scenes featurettes on this movie, specifically for this video, and basically the aliens idea went like this. It was George who had the idea to make it aliens. Spielberg didn't want to do aliens, not because it was a bad idea, but because he had already made 2 alien movies, E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. George kept insisting on the aliens idea, citing how it could be like a B movie like War of the Worlds, which was reflective of the Cold War itself. So just like those 50s alien movies, it was representative of the setting. This is what I mean when I say the film is very 50s. Now hearing this, people would just use this to shit all over George Lucas, which I still feel is unfair. Because even if Spielberg didn't want aliens, or the altered idea that was interdimensional beings, he still approved of the idea eventually. And that's very important. He had a say in the movie, and he was convinced of George's idea in the end. Online I've heard the criticism that the film is a mishmash of genres, and I just don't see it. Apparently it's structured like a 30s serial, which I disagree with, given how the film draws inspiration from many 1950s movies. Sure, the archaeology is there, but that's to be expected of an Indiana Jones movie, so I don't see what the goddamn problem is. Anyways, when the Soviets are distracted by the alien, which is glorious to see, I love the props design, Indy steals a weapon for both himself and Mac, and demands they drop their guns or Sparko is dead. And here comes the reveal.
Why, Mac?
Now, I have 2 things to praise here. First, the twist villain is revealed very early on. A lot of the time, it feels tedious having a twist villain halfway through or towards the end, so it's a breath of fresh air, that the film isn't trying to deceive us. Second, I especially love the line where Mac tells Indy why he joined the Russians. He says,
Well, what can I say, Jonesy? I'm a capitalist. And they pay.
This further establishes Mac's character. He's basically a turncoat on his country and the West, and he doesn't care that the Russians are communists, he just wants money. I find this one line to say a lot about his character. What I think this line also does is further establish the Soviets as the villains, not because they bribed Mac, but because of their hypocrisy. Communism in the most basic definition, based on what the Soviets followed, is wealth being spread equally amongst everyone, and everyone putting all the work they can put in and take what they need. Obviously, the Soviets don't follow this one mindset one bit, as they relied on capitalism and the idea behind it, to bribe Mac into joining him. I mean, it is said by many pro-communists that the Soviet Union wasn't real communism or whatever because they practiced capitalistic ideas too much, so there's a lot said by that one line on a deeper level. Mac also reveals the only reason he lost his money was because of gambling, so it's literally his own fault he's broke. I find this representative of real life to an extent. Lee Harvey Oswald, the widely accepted assassin of John F. Kennedy, was an American who supported Marxism and even lived in the USSR. So anyways, with his friend betraying him, Indy uses the opportunity to throw his gun to the ground and causes the gun to fire at one of the Russians' foots. He uses the confusion to run away. And this is our first action sequence. We see Indy avoid gunfire, sort of like how he ran fast enough to avoid the traps in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it's classic Indiana Jones actions. How could you be upset at this? They also get really creative with how Indy flees, when he has to carefully step on top of the warehouse on wood beams. Dovchenko eventually catches up to Indy, and they do the old-fashioned fight. And damn is it brutal, with Dovchenko using a metal chain to try and whip Indy, where the sound effects and the sheer force represents the danger and how much I could relate to Indy, given I wouldn't want to be whipped with that either. A countdown starts when Indy kicks Dovchenko into a control panel, and it almost seems that Indy is dead when Dovchenko uses the chains to try and strangle him. A minor gripe I do have is the Russians and Mac running towards the missile tester when there's clearly a timer that is a code red warning to get out of the way, because only Mac survives and all the other Russians get burnt to death. Then we've got the subtle humor of the faces Harrison Ford and Igor Zhizhkin probably butchered that make when the missile goes at an insanely fast rate. It's pretty amusing. So then Indiana Jones, after experiencing the G-force of the missile, barely escapes and hikes across the desert. There, he finds a small town in the middle of nowhere. Now this is part of the movie I also like. Indy goes into the small town and slowly realizes that the place is a nuclear testing site. And what made for an especially clever joke is the bomb being called "I like Ike," which earlier in the movie, Indy said that very phrase. George Lucas's foreshadowing is especially present here, and there's probably many other moments I'm not thinking of. Also, the set they made is impressive, and adds to the humour. Like, another complaint of this movie is the overuse of CGI, which of course people would complain about that, but the thing is, there's plenty of practical effects in the film. I especially like the costumes in this movie. The CGI is only used when necessary for over-the-top set pieces for the film, such as what I'm going to describe. As the nuclear countdown starts, Indy hides in the fridge to protect himself from the blast, which is an extreme stretch logically, but it suits the movie because when has this series ever been realistic? Apparently people use this specific scene to shit on the movie, and I've never understood why. There's plenty of examples of realism being thrown aside. I've actually heard that physicists have said that it's possible that Indy would have actually survived this. And Indy survived a lot. So this scene fits in with the rest of the spectacle. I honestly looked at the scene on YouTube, and the top comments gave really positive impressions of the scene. I was heavily expecting people to rip the scene apart, but I got the opposite, which made me believe that this scene is hated for a reason that is ulterior, and to pin the blame of the movie squarely on George Lucas. Plus, the scene is iconic. It's been referenced in games like Fallout New Vegas, so there must have been something to it. Like, I saw someone suggest it could have been a nearby Fallout shelter, but that wouldn't make for an iconic scene now, would it? Nuking the fridge is way more memorable than nuking the Fallout shelter. I think the former has a better ring to it. So then we get the scene that establishes more about the villains. The FBI question Indy on the fact that he aided KGB agents break into Area 51. This scene establishes with what happened in more detail. Now, people do complain that the part of this movie is convoluted, because after the scene, we get the usual Professor Jones scene with the Dean, Charles Stanforth. They say how the plot point about Indy being investigated by the FBI is not touched upon much in the film, but I wouldn't say it's convoluted. The scene is basically essentially to set up what's been happening in the past decade, where Marcus Brody and Henry Jones Sr. are now dead. Now, a well-known fact is that Sean Connery was asked for the cameo in this film, but he wasn't interested in coming out of retirement. He declined, and George Lucas said it was probably for the best in retrospect, because the audience would be disappointed that Henry wasn't coming on the adventure. So with that being said, I disagree that the plot is convoluted, because the FBI investigating has a cause and effect, where Indy takes a train and we are met with a new character, Mutt Williams. Now, I wanted to talk about the cast in this movie. I think every character is well cast. Harrison Ford, as mentioned before, still brings the charm of his character despite the character's age. He was clearly invested in playing the character again after 20 years. This is confirmed in the behind-the-scenes featurettes, because Harrison Ford absolutely wanted to do another movie. On top of Mac being a great character in my opinion, the actor Ray Winstone brings across a charismatic yet snitchy performance to his character, so it's a perfect match. Now, I want to talk about Shia LaBeouf now. Shia LaBeouf gets way too much shit as an actor. I looked into the behind-the-scenes stuff regarding the original Bayformers trilogy, and personally, I think his performance was great. He was supposed to play a teenage boy, and the criticism of his over-the-top panicky performance never really convinced me. Given how Sam Witwicky was written, I think Shia LaBeouf was perfect for the role. Of course, the character itself is a different story, because he is absolutely a bit of a shallow person in the original Bayformers trilogy, and not exactly hero or relatable protagonist material. Honestly, and this is my brutal opinion, but Shia LaBeouf would have made a great Kylo Ren himself. Of course, Adam Driver looks absolutely nothing like either Harrison Ford or Carrie Fisher, and Shia LaBeouf does look like Harrison Ford, but there's more to it than that. Seriously, when I think of Shia LaBeouf, I think of some outcast who smokes, curses, and drinks, and that's a great fit for Kylo Ren as he appeared in the highly inconsistent sequel trilogy. He literally is Kylo Ren in anything but name. Like, most actors play into a personality, but Shia LaBeouf is the personality. It's like when they cast J.K. Simmons to be J. Jonah Jameson in the Spider-Man movies. To date, J.K. Simmons might be one of the finest casting choices ever, and I believe Shia LaBeouf could potentially surpass that, although it's a slim chance, but it's probably the closest we could get. Anyways, what do I think of Shia LaBeouf here as Mutt Williams? Well, I think he's great. Shia LaBeouf watched 50s movies like Rebel Without a Cause to play a greaser James Dean-esque character. The character is kinda obviously, well, you know whose son, but it's not a reveal that breaks the story or makes it a failed plot twist, because the movie is never pretentious about it, or acts like it's the reveal of the ages. We'll get into this more when we get to that part. So anyways, Mutt and Indy discuss Harold Oxley, who both characters know is a fond person they remember. Basically, the mystery of this film is a place called Akator. Indy explains that the conquistadors called it El Dorado, a place that was thousands of years ahead of its time, and that a man named Francisco de Orellana went missing looking for it in 1546. So with that being said, the MacGuffin of the film, the Crystal Skull, is the main motivation for many of the characters, and Indy explains when Mutt asks him what Ox would want with the skull, that the skull was stolen in the 15th or 16th century, and whoever returns the skull gets control over its power, and it's probably the reason Mutt's mother and Ox went missing. It isn't revealed straight away who Mutt's mother is, although it's easy to make an educated guess, given the marketing and the poster. Well anyways, 2 KGB agents show up before the two can even think about helping Ox, or Mutt's mother. They are about to take the two away when Indy tells Mutt to punch a Letterman, which causes chaos between greasers and Lettermen, and devolves into the funniest part of the movie, which is certainly helped by the casual music that plays during the scene.
Get that, greaser!
Mutt and Indy escape by getting on Mutt's motorcycle, and the whole action sequence is another cool part of the movie, because it's tonally consistent with the first action sequence, and in the series in general. The whole chase basically has both Mutt and Indy outrun the KGB, and they eventually make it back to Indy's home, that they must go to Peru to find the Crystal Skull. So there's the classic moving overseas sequence. Before they make it to a small town, and after asking around, they discover that Harold Oxley was put in a mental asylum, one that's very poverty-stricken, and doesn't seem like it would actually help the mentally ill one bit. Again, the set design is literally perfect. You can tell a lot by this nameless asylum based on how it looks. We get some characterization for Mutt, which starts when Indiana Jones references an episode from the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, where Indy recounts meeting Pancho Villa, which it's good that George Lucas has kept continuity intact and didn't separate from the two stories. So that's a good bit of fan service for hardcore fans. On top of that, we get some insight to Mutt Williams as a character. Mutt discusses how he didn't get along that well with his mother because he quit many schools he was enrolled in. I like this exchange because it tells us a lot about Mutt as a character. And he's sort of like me. I am kind of lazy and disinterested in school, so he's very relatable for someone like me. When Indy and Mutt make it to the asylum, we're told that men with guns took Oxley away, and that all that's left on the trail is his prison cell. Again, the set design is fantastic. We see how Ox has lost his mind, as Indy and Mutt realize he's drawn the Crystal Skull in every area with the word return in different languages. I also appreciate Mutt's expression here as he looks heartbroken, which further establishes the relationship between he and Mutt, even though we haven't even seen the character yet. So with that being said, Indy and Mutt discover that Ox actually found Oriana's resting place. I love the mystery this film presents. It's honestly better than Attack of the Clones even, to be honest. Anyways, Indy and Mutt go to a gravesite and get attacked by native people, I suppose. Native people that are absolutely mental because they attack both of them. Since I've heard zero complaints about this scene, there isn't much to talk about. Probably because there's nothing wrong with this scene. Like, maybe Red Letter Media came up with some nonsense to shit all over it. Speaking of which, I tried watching Plinkett's review on the film, and it was terrible. Offensive jokes, dragged out tangents that say nothing, and random bullshit and nitpicks that aren't even valid as bullshit and nitpicks. Like, the dude clearly missed the point of not only this movie, but the whole series, and didn't consider any nuances. He was just a poor reviewer in general, and of course played out of context clips from the featurettes to slander George Lucas. He's just a fucking idiot as usual. Like, I watched the featurettes as mentioned before, and yeah, he's taking those clips out of context and failing to get the full picture. He didn't even come up with creative insults to throw at George, and just repeated the same crap over and over again. It's just pathetic. Well, back to the film. The fight doesn't last long, because Indy uses a native's blowpipe against him, which is really brutal, and goes against the toned down violence argument. He scares another one off with his gun, and the dialogue is excellent.
You're a teacher?
Part-time.
So they enter the gravesite, and once again, the set design is excellent. It's very reminiscent of the other movies. One of my main praises for the movie is the discovery and the mystery of the Crystal Skull, even though it's clear at this point that it's aliens. The mystery about the alien visitors, why they visited, who they were, where they came from is intriguing, and it definitely kept my attention. So with that being said, they discover the corpses of the conquistadors. That includes Oriana, where they discover, of course, the Crystal Skull, discovering that non-magnetic materials attached to it. They also conclude that Oxley had been there twice, once to find the skull, and second to put the skull back. So the intrigue is also there. Anyways, with the Crystal Skull retrieved, they make it outside where, Mac and the Russians were waiting for them. So now they are transported north into the Amazon jungle. Of course, Indy is tied up, where we get some more interaction between Mac and Indy. Mac gloats about saving his life for the third time, and Indy, still pissed about his betrayal, sarcastically says that if he unties him, he'll give him a big hug. I love the dialogue exchange in this movie, as I've already made it clear. The conversations characters have are wonderfully acted, but on top of that, are well written. In the spatter between the two, Max says that he doesn't actually care about allegiances, which adds character to him. I'd say that his character is simplistic in concept, but in-depth in execution. He's the sort of character I want to see more from. I looked on the Indiana Jones wiki, and aside from being in the Crystal Skull and all associated media, he's only been in one other story, that being a novel called Indiana Jones and the Army of the Dead, a prequel to this movie which is a disgrace. I want more from this character to be explored in the future. Maybe he'll turn up in the upcoming Indiana Jones game made by Bethesda? I can hope. Well, anyways, we get this line from Mac that reminds me of Spaceballs, actually.
Just about money, isn't it? Oh, only money. A gigantic pile of money.
We're not just doing this for money. We're doing it for a shitload of money.
Irina Sparko then shows up, and their interactions are consistent with what she and Indy said to each other at the start. The exchange gives us more information about the aliens, and we get the classic George Lucas trope of foreshadowing. When Sparko goes on about gaining knowledge more important than the weapon that was the nuclear bomb, and Indy tells her and says, "Be careful what you wish for, you might just get it." I'm sure there are other subtle hints in other parts of the movie, because foreshadowing is a staple of Lucas's work. So now we're introduced to Harold Oxley, the character that's lost his mind. I like how Ox's character for most of the movie, starting with his first proper appearance, represents the threat of the Crystal Skull, because the scene after, Indy is forced to stare into the Crystal Skull, and given what happened to Ox, it makes the scene chilling, because we know it's at stake for Indy's mind, especially since the stakes were set up so quickly. Like, imagine this movie but Harold Oxley is sane for the entire movie, or this part in particular. This scene could have just been a staring contest. This is a staple of show don't tell. So what I especially like about the staring at the skull scene is the ambience. Indy almost loses his mind before Mac demands that the Soviets stop trying to break Indy's mind, and they oblige. Mac then releases Indy, and true to Indy's word just a few minutes before, he smacks Mac in the nose. The next scene is the reintroduction of Marion Ravenwood, played by the same actress, Karen Allen. Of course, it's established right away that the two didn't leave on the best of terms, which is consistent with Last Crusade, given how she didn't show up in that one. Temple of Doom is a prequel, by the way. It's also here where it's revealed to Indy that Mutt and Marion are mother and son. Of course, we don't have much time to think about it, because Marion is used as a hostage to get Indy to comply, so the tension is maintained, and the sense of urgency goes on. I remember Plinkett tried to criticize the movie for Indy willfully helping the bad guys, which is just pathetically lazy of him not to realize that in both situations, both at the start and this scene, that the threat of his own life and others prevented them from opposing him. Like at the start, Indy was probably looking out for Mac, and this was at the point before Mac was revealed to be a traitor, and the exact moment after he's revealed to be one, Indy then immediately tries to escape, because now it's only his skin he's looking out for. So basically, Indy tries to communicate with Ox, and he basically realizes that he needs a pencil and some paper, where he then draws symbols that represent where they're supposed to go to find Akator. To keep the sense of urgency, the rebellious Mutt causes a distraction that gets him and his chaps the opportunity to escape. Hiding from the Soviets, both Marion and Indy get stuck in a dry sand pit, and Mutt goes to find something to pull them both out. So it's here where Indy and Marion are alone, and of course, the reveal. Mutt is Indy's son. His actual name is Henry Jones III. I like how his attitude completely changes when he realizes that Mutt is his offspring. Mutt comes back with a snake, and of course, Indy is reluctant to touch the snake because of aldibophobia, whatever the phobia is called, as established in the first movie.
Grab the snake!
I'm calling it that!
Do it! Make your dreams come true! Just do it!
The comedic effect of this scene is excellent, basically because he has to pretend it's a rope to escape, and of course they get caught because of Ox's instability. Now one thing I should generally say is, people who don't mind this movie say that the second half is weaker than the first. Personally, I still think it has great merit to it. I mean, instead of being in many locations like the first half, the second half has the characters exclusively be in the Amazon jungle. So I feel stuff like that made people feel this was a weaker half. I haven't really heard a proper explanation on why casual watchers don't like the second half, so this is a completely random guess. What I can say is that the second half definitely has something different to it than the first half, but I believe that it only got a tad bit worse. But the film was good enough to keep that to a minimum. Although the adventure isn't quite as prominent here, I believe the second half does Indy's character arc justice. You see, in the following scene, it's revealed to Mutt that Indy is his father. He's in instant denial, but Marion tells him that the unseen Colin Williams was his stepfather. Basically, Indy's in a midlife crisis, because of all the flaws he kept with him throughout his whole life. Indiana Jones is an older man now. It's time that he adapts to his mature age and learns to be a better man. Throughout the original Indiana Jones trilogy, Indy is a heavily flawed character. He's a loose womanizer, he's cocky, he's essentially the Han Solo of his universe. And just like Han Solo in the OT, he must learn to be better. You see, the reason an arc like this didn't happen in The Last Crusade was because Indy was a younger man, around late 30s, while in this movie, he is a 64-year-old man. Remember the scene earlier in the movie where Indy talks about the deaths of Marcus Brody and his father? Well, in that same scene, the Dean talks about death and how as we all get older, life starts taking away more than it gives. So that's another reason why that scene wasn't pointless, despite what people want to say. I mean, it wasn't just like Indiana Jones being older would have meant that he would have just been the same as an American James Bond forever. So that's my 2 cents on the matter, an observation that George Lucas haters never picked up on. In fact, I believe that Sean Connery's Henry Jones Sr. is exactly the type of arc James Bond would have when he got older. He probably settled down with Anna Mary, that's Indiana Jones' mother, and of course, as we all know, she died of illness as mentioned in The Last Crusade. Just look at Henry Jones Sr. if anyone has an issue with Indiana Jones being older in this movie. So basically, Indy and Mutt knock Jovchenko out, and Indy unties Marion, and we get a brief bit of dialogue between the two.
I'm sure I wasn't the only one to go on with my life. There must have been plenty of women for you over the years.
There were a few, but they all had the same problem.
Yeah, what's that?
They weren't you, honey.
I really like this line, because it shows that Indy cared about Marion more than those other women he screwed. I mean, in Raiders, his relationship with Marion was always the most in-depth one, given how Marion and Indy knew each other for years, so he knocks out the driver and grabs an RPG and uses it to blow the tree cutter in front. Of course, I don't see anything wrong with the CGI. Like, it isn't the best, but people want to make it out to be the devil, when it's really serviceable. Like, you guys notice all the practical sets used in the film, right? The CGI is only used for scenes where practical isn't an option. I'm not even sure if I'm giving the special effects enough credit, but of course people complain about the overuse of CGI when, just like the prequels, that's barely an argument. Like I've said before, there is such a thing as bad practical effects and good CGI. The following scene is action that is the fight over the skull. With the Shredder destroyed, the three hijack a vehicle, and this is probably the textbook example of what people didn't like about the action. Mostly it's people who complain about CGI in the sequence, but I haven't actually heard on why the sequence is bad beyond that. It's mostly a case of the shallow CGI bad, practical good mentality once again. So with that being said, let me explain why this action sequence is actually good. The scene is reminiscent of Indiana Jones fights, but beyond that, the action is great because it follows all the rules of an action scene. It cuts between shots constantly, there's a lot going on with actual consequences beyond the characters' lives, that being, stopping the Soviets from reaching Akator and returning the skull to it. When I saw the scene, I felt it was like a modern rendition of the original films. None of the named characters are useless either. They all have something to do besides Oxley, of course, because he's lost his mind. Let's have a look at all the characters. Indy retrieves the skull after using the RPG, Marion drives, Mutt faces off against Irina Sparko before getting caught in the vines, Irina Sparko commands the soldiers and faces off against Mutt, Dovchenko gets into a fist fight with Indy later on. The only character that sort of does nothing is Mac. All he does is join the main group after he talks about how his actual allegiance is CIA, and that he's actually a double agent spy and whatnot. I remember Plinkett also tried criticizing the film and making Indy out to be an idiot for trusting Mac, but given all I've pointed out, given how Mac literally tells Indy he hinted his true alliance in the tent, and after Mac proves himself to Indy by knocking out a Soviet, I think that's fair enough for Indy to trust Mac. But there's also something else I should discuss. Mutt getting stuck on a vine and swinging with monkeys. Again, I never actually heard why it's bad. The scene is very campy, but so are a lot of other scenes in the original films. All three of them. I don't know why I'm even discussing this, I had to bring it up eventually. Monkeys have been in the first movie, and as I'd like to point out, the monkey in that was highly intelligent and only died because it was indulging on poisoned food. So criticizing the monkeys for following Mutt's lead is ridiculous. I also see another big criticism that the film lacks grit, which I strongly disagree with. The monkey swinging scene might not be dark, but there's plenty of other stuff in the film that are. One example being the killer ants. Basically a swarm of ants come and attack everyone, and damn are they threatening. It's shown that these ants are brutal and lead to a really painful death. Like, I wouldn't want to get caught in any swarm of these ants. And they play into the Indiana Jones trope of bugs and vermin. A fist fight ensues between Indy and Dovchenko, and I was on the edge of my seat, because this is probably the closest in the movie that I felt Indy has come close to dying. The fight is surrounded by ants, and given what we know what happens if the swarm gets you, we want Indy to outclass this guy. And when Dovchenko gets caught in the swarm, my god is it brutal. The ants drag him into the ant colony, presumably that he's still alive. Like, gee, I feel really bad for the guy, despite him being the brutish tough guy, because the pain on his face says it all. Of course, Indy makes it out with the others, and Marion drives off the cliff to escape the Russians. The next scene is essentially a water park ride. As said by Ox earlier in the movie, 3 times it drops, which I guess was foreshadowing for this scene. There isn't much to say about this scene, because it's basically a SeaWorld attraction. What this leads to is the final stage of the movie, where they finally enter the temple. Given the build-up in the film, the payoff, I feel, is huge. When they enter the temple, we get more information about the aliens. Essentially, they were the ones who kickstarted civilization by teaching the Mayans how to farm and other basic stuff that was pivotal for the creation of modern mankind. The visuals on the walls make this story feel ancient and mysterious, adding to the intrigue. After getting out of the temple, they are chased by native people, and these guys don't fuck around, because they swarm the group. And to further add the significance of the crystal skull, when Ox pulls out the skull, just like the ants in their own way, they stay away from the skull, and it lets all 5 of them proceed. I heard that this was called the worst scene of the movie by one critic, who just nitpicked shit like how native people appeared and other BS that doesn't matter. So with that being said, they make it to a pillar, and of course Max still wants the gold. Indy, with his problem solving, realizes that they need to destroy the sand blockers to open the temple. Again, it's naturally progressing the story, and it shows Indy's problem solving, just like in the original films. Well anyways, they fall down the sand once they're done, and they run down the stairs. Again, the set design is fantastic. Overuse of CGI my ass. The slowness of the sequence is further building up to the climax, because they use the skull to open the door to the skull equivalent of the Jedi Council, I guess. Mac, of course, reveals to Indy that he, again, is a traitor. Although it isn't really a fake out, because again, they show us that Mac was a spy to lead the Reds. Although I have a theory that at this point, he was actually just trying to lure the Reds and everyone else into the Skull Council while he picked off all the gold. He's a literal interpretation of a gold digger in that case. I also especially love Indy's line when Mac pulls a gun on him again.
So what are you, a triple agent?
Of course, given that this is the second time, Indy sounds more annoyed than betrayed. This is also where shit hits the fan. Sparko is the one who directly reattaches the skull to the missing head, and the overzealous Sparko demands knowledge from the council, which, just like what was foreshadowed, she gets exactly what she wanted. The knowledge she sought overloads her mind, and she dies. So as part of my theory that I mentioned a minute ago, Mac is the first one to run out of the room. Ox's sanity is returned, and they all decide to get the hell out of there. And even though Mac betrayed Indy, he still tries to save his friend, and I liked how they wrapped up his story. It's sort of like a subtle redemption for the character, but it isn't direct. Instead, Mac tells Indy that he's going to be fine, and then seconds later, gets sucked into the chaos. I like the final line Mac ended on, because it shows that he wasn't complete, shallow, greedy trash the whole time. With that being said, the rest escape and get washed up to the surface as they say the UFO take off. Of course, in classic Indiana Jones fashion, they show us the true meaning of the legend, that the treasure wasn't gold, but knowledge, and that the aliens did not come from space, but the space between spaces, which is a fancy way of saying they're dimensional travelers. Of course, Mutt and Indy reconcile their issues after the adventure they just went through, where Indy pays tribute to Henry Jones Sr. by saying,
Somewhere your grandpa is laughing.
This really touched me, especially now that Sean Connery is no longer with us. So as I've mentioned before, Indy's arc is learning to be a better man, so he finally decides to make himself complete by getting married, something that he hasn't been able to do in the other movies. He is married at last. Seriously, it would have just been so shallow if Indy hooked up with another woman for the 4th time. Bringing back Marion was not just fan service. Her character needed to be in the movie for Indy's arc to work. So with that being said, the movie ends with Mutt about to pick up Indy's hat after the wind blows it to him, but Indy takes the hat to reaffirm that he is the one who will always be Indiana Jones. So of course, the classic theme starts playing and the film ends. What a classic new adventure that got all the recognition and praise it deserved. Yeah, right. So this is practically my scene-by-scene review of Kingdom the Crystal Skull. Hopefully I've made it clear that this is in actuality a gem. Like I no doubt expect people to realize this film's true quality when Indy 5 comes out and is a shallow pandering movie most likely. I'm making this video now so that I can prove that this film was great from the start, and people overlooked its qualities to continue spiting George Lucas. Like, a lot of people say that George Lucas should have been the idea guy and someone should have written the script and directed the movie. That's exactly what happened here, but they still complain about it, so I doubt that Lucas's involvement is actually the problem here, because this is pretty much what prequel haters wanted, and once they get it, they still complain about it. It's absolutely hypocritical. In conclusion, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is indeed underrated. People want to make stupid complaints like the overuse of CGI, which is ignoring all the great practical sets the film has. Like, I'm sure that we can all agree that John Williams' score is an instant classic, and far more memorable than the sequel trilogy, but I didn't mention it, because John Williams' scores are always good. It was better to point out the actual story, the presentation, the cinematography, the action, and way much more, because that's where the real quality of the film should be. Music is important, but it's also icing on the cake. If you want to argue fan service, Last Crusade has way more. In fact, I wouldn't even say Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is the weakest of the 4 movies. I'd say that title goes to Last Crusade. Problems I have with it include the fact that it's too reminiscent of the first movie and fan service. Of course, it's still a great movie because the conflict between Indy and his father, the action, the Holy Grail, and of course the brilliant ending that no, it wasn't ruined in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. The reason I made this video is because I want to prove that I've seen George Lucas's other work, and say that I know he's a good filmmaker. I will eventually get around to watching American Graffiti, which I look forward to watching. Also, the reason that this video is probably as long as my Last Jedi review at this point is because to my knowledge, I'm practically the first person to defend the movie in detail. Like, other defenders of the movie don't talk about specifics much. They mostly go like, oh yeah, I understand a lot of people don't like this movie, but I personally do. Because I want to be the person who puts his foot down and uses this film and its quality as its extension for George Lucas and the prequels. So with that being said, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is an automatic 8.5 out of 10. A solid movie on its own, and a worthy follow-up to the original films. If you didn't think relatively highly about this movie, then I hope that by watching this video, it will give you another opportunity to watch the movie again. This time, with what I've said in mind. So I've gone on and on about this film. Now it's time to wrap everything up. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
We found you hiding, we found you lying, choking on the dirt and sand, your former glories and all your stories, dragged and washed with eager hands.